committee, but every committee member spent a lot of time doing research. We got some excellent information, and we hope to continue that interaction with the committee. And I was thinking, whoever comes in here as superintendent would really enjoy maybe having some sort of gathering with that committee, because they do represent the entire community. So outstanding work. And we're pleased that right now John Reichert is going to present the recommendation of the committee. John?
Thank you, Dr. Vogel, and good morning, board. Based on the work of the committee, and I must echo what Dr. Vogel said, it was a great group. They were very professional, very respectful of each other during the process, and did a ton of homework. So again, congratulations for the work that the committee did. The names and candidates in which the committee is bringing forward to the board for your further consideration are as follows. Number 7, Dr. Brennan Asquin. Number 11, Dr. Peter Licata. Number 23, Mr. Keith Oswald. Number 26, Dr. Gonzalo Lacava. And number 31, Dr. Marie Esquerdo. So those names are being submitted forward to the board for your further consideration. And as previously discussed, certainly the board has an option to add anyone to the list that maybe the board would like to consider further as well, or accept the committee recommendations and we move forward with our existing timeline.
Okay, we're open for board discussion.
I want to, my name is Shirley Brown. I am the vice chair. I will be taking over this workshop today because our chair is recovering some minor surgery, and she's at home joining us by Zoom. Hello, Caroline.
Hi, Shirley.
Jane, are you raising your hand or just waving? Both. Jane?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank our committee, our Citizens Committee, who met twice, and a third time if you consider the rules and regulations, and gave us such great results. I've certainly reached out to a number of those that I had recommended to be on the committee, but I really think that it's a great idea, Bill, to have maybe a committee reception for the new superintendent. I think that would be a great idea. So I wrote that down. But in looking and listening to the 2 nights of their discussion, it was really very helpful to me. And personally, I would like to move forward these 5 names as our semifinalists and maybe even finalists, because I think we can go forward with this with great clarity, at least on my part, that these are the people that would be finalists that I would consider. And I would rather have 5 finalists than 3 or 4. And I think this gives us, if we do this today, this would give us time to have those 5 questions answered that we were expecting to do for our semifinalists, and then move forward into really analyzing and reviewing them before we bring the 5 in here for interviews. And we all take this very seriously, and this gives us the time that we really need to do that job. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you, Ms. Goodwin. Mr. Vogel, I too think all 5 of them are great, and I know we are going to be sending out 5 questions, and some of them will be giving us a response via Zoom, and others will be giving us, not Zoom, but recorded responses. And I'm torn also whether we should just bring all 5 back, or possibly at that 23rd, if each of us gave the top 3, and if there was some clear direction for the top 3, like say if somebody only got 1 vote, perhaps dropping them off. But you know, I'll go with the committee either way. I know that 5 is a lot, but if perhaps after the 5 questions, if we could narrow it to the top 3, which might narrow it to the top 4, because I mean, I can't imagine us coming back with a 5-0 vote on any one of these candidates. They are really good, and at this time I have no idea where I want to go, and maybe if we were to narrow it down by one, it might help things go faster and smoother when we come back. But, I'll take the
Shirley.
direction from the rest of the board on that.
Shirley?
Caroline?
Yes, I'm raising my hand.
You're raising your hand and I'm calling on you.
Okay. I would like to bring back the 5 as our semifinalists. I think all of them are well qualified, and I would not like to sit here today and weed out 1 or 2. I would prefer all 5 come back, and we have an ability to be able to talk to them and ask them the questions that we have.
Carolyn, are you at home?
I'm at home.
Could you take off the mask? It's a little hard to hear you. I mean, if you're just in your home.
I'm not in my home. I have 2 people with me in my room.
Oh, that's right. You've got
In
staff
a
with you.
room.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I wasn't suggesting that we
hang
take
on, let
any
me
of
finish.
these out.
Mrs. Brown, may I finish?
Sure.
I would also like to thank our committee for doing an excellent job. I think we were very fortunate. We had a cross-section of our committee. We had every nationality represented, and we had not staff, but we had a good representation. And I think it would be a great idea to have a committee reception at the end of when we choose a finalist. I think it would be great to be able to get together with everyone. And I would like to echo my colleagues in thanking all of those members for taking the time and doing a really thorough job on vetting the candidates. That's it.
And I wanted to clarify, I think all 5 of them should get the questions that we've asked.
Right.
And it's just whether or not there's someone we could eliminate after we get those questions. And I'll go either way. I'll go whatever the board wants to do.
Okay.
Any other comments? Bridget?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, again, yes, I want to also thank the committee members for their time and their passion, and I also want to applaud the FSBA and our IT staff because, again, I know that we had to transition and do something unique, but I think it really ended up being to a benefit to the entire community, so they were able to participate and listen. And I know as a board member, it was really wonderful to just hear the committee's comments and the thought process as they went through them. So, and at the end of it, I'm very pleased with the 5 candidates that we have. I'm very excited about it. I know Mr. Vogel and I spoke as far as what our timeline looks like, and I agree. I would like to see all 5 move forward. And I understand what you're saying is making sure, we want to come together and support who that right person is, but for the next step, I think it makes sense and I believe based logistically, it was confirmed that we do have enough time if we were to bring all 5 forward. So that would be my preference, and I think that'll just allow us to get a better sense of who's the best fit and discuss it together as a board. So,
Thank you. Mr. Robinson?
Thank you. Do you have the thing, am I supposed to raise my hand, or is this thing working right now because of where you're sitting?
It's not working where I'm
Okay,
sitting.
all right, that's why I was just confused. I agree that I think what the purpose of today's meeting is whether we want to accept the 5, add to the 5, or subtract to the 5, and that next we'll be looking at whether we want to do anything to the finalists, which some people have discussed. So as it pertains to today, I agree with everybody else to stick with the 5 and move forward with the process, and then see where it plays out for how we want to do the finalists. So I think, believe it or not, won a 5-0 agreement during the superintendent search process.
So are we talking that we need another meeting on the 23rd to perhaps narrow it, or just move forward on the just move forward to July?
My preference is to continue on with the process that's already been outlined.
So coming back on the 23rd?
I thought that's what the process was.
Fine.
But
Mr.
I mean,
Vogel?
if the rest of the board wants to change the process, I'm only one board member.
Yes. Just a clarification. The board, I'm hearing a consensus that the board is accepting the committee's 5 individuals, and no one wants to add or delete anyone at this point. I've heard discussion about moving directly to the finalist stage, and
Yes.
if the board would like to do that, then what would happen is the board would declare all 5 of these individuals as finalists. And Mr. Reichert has a timetable if that decision, if that consensus is formed right now and later board makes that determination. If the board decided to move forward and declare all of these 5 individuals as finalists, then Mrs. Messina, and that's not the next item on the agenda, would still send out the questions, and they would be back in approximately a week, and we can talk with the actual timeline. They would come back around the 23rd, and then the board would have from the 23rd to the 30th when they come into town to have all of the background checks reviewed, all of the questions to reviewed, and any other research that we need. So that would be the direction we would need right now if the board wanted to take the next step and declare these 5 finalists. And I heard different discussion on that.
Now, if we declared the 5 finalists, we would not have a meeting on the 23rd.
We would still be available on the 23rd for updates. We would still be here, last minute situations that might come up, just in making sure the schedules are all in place and so forth. So it would be a short meeting. I believe you have a meeting scheduled for the 23rd anyway. So we would be here for just updates or questions.
Mr. Robinson?
So I have some questions if we're going to be changing the procedure. So when would we get back the 5 questions?
Okay. Mrs. Messina has a timeline. What we were thinking, and I can just summarize this, you would get those back in 1 week. We were thinking back, if you declare all 5 finalists, you'd be getting them back on the 22nd.
So the Zoom would be recorded? It wouldn't be live with them answering the question?
Yes. It will be posted. Mrs. Messina, why don't you talk a little bit about the process and the potential
I have multiple questions that are going to be changing the process. I have multiple questions
that's
around
fine.
that.
That's fine. Mrs. Messina?
Yes, thank you. Either way, whether you declare that these are the semifinalists or the finalists, we're prepared to send them the letter that has the questions contained in it. There are 2 written questions, as you may recall, where they're supposed to answer each question 250 words or less, and there are 3 video responses estimating 3 minutes each with a video no longer than 10 minutes. They will be able to, we like to give them at least over a weekend because we know that they are working right now and we don't want to take them away from their current district during the day. So we like to at least give them the weekend time to be able to do that. We would originally, and I'm going to go with you, Mr. Robinson, based on the current timeline that we have, we were going to set the deadline for Sunday, June the 21st. I want to say maybe by 7 p.m. to me. They would have to get those videos to me and those written questions to me. That would give me some time to upload them up to the Vimeo site so that I could send you all the links. You all could review them on Monday the 22nd and the 23rd until your meeting on the 23rd to decide on the finalists. That's the original schedule as currently exists. If you changed and made them finalists immediately, we wouldn't have to get them by Sunday the 21st. We still could. You could decide that deadline. But I would probably recommend we give them until the 23rd, which would be 1 week, and then that would give you a week to review them. But I need time once they submit them to upload them to the Vimeo so that I can send access to you all.
Do I start the floor or not?
I'm sorry, Eric.
So I just wasn't sure. I mean, it's scary when you ask a question because you're never sure if you're going to get the floor back.
I'll let you have the mic, but not the floor.
Okay. So my personal feeling is I have no problem. I think all 5 are great. I want to move all 5 forward. I just feel that we are losing an option. I would rather meet on June 23rd as proposed. That way we can look at the Zoom, look at the written questions, and we could decide then, after we have additional information, let's make these all 5. What I would hate to do, we make all 5 finalists, we get the Zoom, we get the letters, and we realize a couple of them aren't where we want, and then we're kind of like stuck with having them come down, stuck with interviewing them. I would rather have the flexibility of all it is instead of, if I understand Ms. Messina correctly, instead of getting it on the 22nd, they're going to get it to us on the 23rd. I mean, it's 1 day, and it gives us additional flexibility. Mm-hmm. So I see absolutely no downside to continuing on with the process as laid out. And in fact, I see upside because it gives us the option of, once we get additional input, of having another decision point in that tree So I see no downside. I only see upside for the board to continue on with the process as previously agreed.
Bridget?
Oh, I agree. So, I mean, I think perhaps we're blending the two together, and so I'm glad that you noted that. So I think all 5 should move forward, answer that question. I think after we questions, we are still meeting, so we can include that and then revisit it and, again, discuss it as a board. And I guess that's a fair point. I'm glad you pointed out that it's not that we're guaranteeing that all 5 would go forward, but we could if we wanted to. So I'm fine with that.
So it looks like we're going to move all 5 forward as semifinalists at this time, and then on the 23rd, we will make the decision if we move 3, 4, or 5 forward.
That sounds good.
That's like pushing the big decision down the wall, because it's going to be a decision. I don't think it's going to be all that easy for any of us, because we've got some great candidates here.
We do. Thank you very much. Thank you for reaching consensus on that. And Mrs. Messina, do you want to go into the more of a review? I know you covered it. If there are any questions to the board on the process, board members have been provided with the summary of the process. So I'm going to turn it back to you to see if you want to expand on that or if there are any questions.
Thank you. And you said board members have been provided a summary of the process, but I think they've been provided a copy of the letter. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was the right item. And you'll notice I kind of put a big box where the questions are because I didn't want them to be publicly consumed. But I have confirmed with each of you the question that you wanted included in the request. And so typically what I would do is wait until after today's board meeting later in the day when you officially determine that all 5 of these are your semifinalists. Right after that, I would send this to each of those semifinalists, giving them the deadline, which you can see in the letter there. And then I will upload them after I receive them so that you can guarantee that, well, as long as there's no technical difficulties, but the goal is to have them to you no later than first thing Monday morning. So I'll be working on that Sunday night. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Andrea?
Yes.
What is the difference between moving them all forward as finalists as opposed to moving them all forward as semifinalists?
Well, I think as Mr. Robinson pointed out, there may be responses to these questions that would help to distinguish some candidates from others. And if in fact that's the case, then having them as semifinalists and making the decision next week who the finalists are, it might be that you would interview only 3 of them or 4 of them, and you might not necessarily bring all 5 in for an interview.
So this would cut down on the number of people needed to travel.
Maybe, but not necessarily. You could still bring all 5.
That's what I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm hearing a consensus on those items. I'd like to just review our background check process. First, I want to thank again the committee for the research that they have done. Our team, FSBA team, is doing reference checking. We have, as we indicated, a law firm which is in the process of having all of the background checks completed. So we will have that information, and all that information will be available to school board members. We also have requested the personnel files of all 5 individuals, and I was told that they may be here in the district today. I'm working with Al on that. And what I'm going to try to do after this meeting, I'm going to go over to see if they're in. I'll go ahead and review them with your HR people, but I encourage all board members to go over to the HR department sometime and look at those files too. There'll be a lot of information in there. Also, we have completed our check with the Professional Practices Services, which is the one that we can go online and determine if there are any completed cases of any of these 5. There were none. We also, because of the efficiency of your HR department, only the HR department certification people can check ongoing or investigations that are in progress. I got a text this morning saying that all 5 of these individuals are all clear on that. So moving forward, we've got that taken care of also. We also encourage board members to call board members in other districts and find out as much information too. So what I am very pleased with this process we have in place, I think with all of the committee members looking at all the documents, getting all this information we've talked to, I think we're moving forward with background checks.
Oh, I'm sorry, Eric.
I made the motion to make the consultant the FSBA, but I had an issue.
You don't vote out of a meeting. You don't vote. You don't vote in workshops.
We're not voting, Eric.
No,
is
I
just
didn't make a
talking,
motion to
please.
vote.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I at a meeting, I made the motion previously to make FSBA the search committee previously. And one of the reasons why I did it was because, the integrity of Mr. Vogel. So I met you initially 4 years ago, and I got to say, through this entire process, you've only added to my respect of you. But I as I said previously, and I still have now, an issue at the last search you did for the board, there was an issue about background checks, which is the topic that we're discussing now. And so I have a couple questions regarding that. And so my first question is, how has your process evolved over the past 4 years in this area?
Do
I need to go into details about the issue, or do you understand the issue?
Yeah, I understand. And
If you need me to clarify,
Mr. Robinson and I have had discussions about this, and the issue the last time was that the personnel file is defined as any and all records relating to an individual, wherever they are, including any investigative files. The one issue that Mr. Robinson is talking about is one district did not turn over the investigative files. And so they were later discovered. So what we have done is the specific request this year was to include investigative files. And I had not seen the files because they're supposedly coming in. In addition, we certainly have been as thorough as we possibly can to make sure that we have uncovered all of the information. And that, and I'd like Mrs. Messina or Mr. Riker to comment, that one situation where the district didn't turn over their personnel file, investigative file, was the only incident that I'm aware of in our searches that did not occur.
Mr. Vogel, can I clarify?
Sure.
Be more specific. Have you changed anything in your processes over the past 4 years, or are you essentially doing the same process, and it was in your contention that Hillsborough messed up? Or have you changed your processes? Because if your processes have been the same, then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, I will say this. We have intensified our work. We essentially were using the same components of the process, but we have intensified our work.
Well, my next question is, if we hired a private investigator to look into the background of these people, could that possibly turn up things about these finalists that your intensified process would not?
It is always a possibility to go ahead and that could happen. It's because once you look at all of the information that you see from the files that come through our law firm's review, I think that may make you more comfortable. I remember 4 years ago, or you were not as actually a board member, so
I did not vote for him. All right.
Right. You didn't at that time. You were a very interested party. We were working closely with you, but so you really didn't see all the background information that was available.
I do believe, Mr. Robinson, that Mr. Vogel said that they highlight or somehow intensify that they want the investigative report. They don't just say they want the record. They want the record, including the investigative report, when they ask for the personnel records.
But the big overall issue is the fact that this one item wasn't found foreshadowed what occurred last year. And that's my concern. I don't want us to miss out on a piece of information that is going to foreshadow, negative impact to the district. Because last year was a very negative experience and a black eye for the district.
Well, that I don't believe had to do with
It had
the
exactly.
Hillsborough County file. Well, let's.
It had to do exactly with
All right,
Hillsborough
in
County.
your opinion, that's what happened, so we'll leave it at that. But I think Mr. Vogel explained that they highlight that they want the investigative file. They specifically ask for it now, rather than just the personnel file.
I just feel that we should do everything we can to make sure what happened in the past doesn't happen
Well,
again.
and I hope that we are moving forward, that we're not. Ms. Bridget?
Yes, so I completely understand the concerns, and so perhaps, and this may be a question for Mr. Hardy or Dr. Vogel, because I understand we are reliant upon, we had a similar issue, as we know, even from a staffing standpoint, when we rely on other districts to provide information or supporting documentation prior to a hire. Is there any kind of legal document that we could include that they are verifying, they are providing us a complete file, so that that transfer of responsibility is confirmed with that particular entity with whom they are employed?
Well, when we make it, I mean, like anybody who makes a public records request, the responding agency is under an obligation to include the information.
Okay.
So we are, to some extent, reliant on them doing what they're supposed to do. I think Dr. Vogel has made the good point to say we want the personnel file, and that specifically includes, any investigative
investigative reports that may be, so if there was a concluded, because in the broadest scope, just not even specifically talking about what had transpired here, but in the broadest scope is certain things aren't, we can't, certain things may or may not be in the hard copy file, if you will, right? But we only can obtain the hard copy file or do additional due diligence. But in the event there was any kind of, I'm just going to use the example of a complaint, and there was a concluded finding, we're asking for the supplement, the backup documentation. Is that correct?
Yes.
I assume that's the case.
Yes, I'm assuming that too. What I'm going to do, like I said, after this meeting is I'm going to find out, because when I talked with Al, he indicated that what some of the districts are doing now is actually stating what they're including in that file. And Al talked to me that one. I'm not sure exactly what wording he is. That's why I want to look at that. But I am concerned too. And being a former HR person and a former superintendent, I can tell you that not all school districts respond the way the district did that Mr. Reichert and I worked in. And sometimes it was hard to get that information, especially investigative files. But, I can tell you, we are being as diligent as possible. And I've actually, I don't know of another search firm that is doing more in this regard than us. And in fact, some of the districts that we work with, after they've seen the comprehensive reports that come back from the law firm that does our work, have hired that law firm to do their background checking too. But I'd like Andrea to comment on this also, and John.
Yeah, and I'll go first. Mr. Robinson, we heretofore, well, I don't mean heretofore, but I mean after your other search, first off, we didn't think we had to say when we asked for personnel files and all other information pertaining to investigations, because it should have been a part of the personnel file. But then when we discovered that not everything is in a personnel file, we did expand our process to include very specifically those any potential investigative files. So that is a change to our process, because we, as Dr. Vogel noted, we expanded it, but we also were much more specific. And also, as Dr. Vogel just mentioned, we've previously we didn't have the step of working with your HR department to actually check the active certification John, you'll give me the correct terms for that, but the active certification ongoing, if there's anything with a certification, that's another additional step that we've added, because that will tell us if there are any open cases that the state certification department is looking into. We don't have access to that information because we don't work for a school district. We have to work with your HR departments to get that, and that is another additional layer that we added very specifically to see if there's ongoing things that may not have yet concluded. John, I'm sorry, I don't know the exact name for that, but I know you do.
Right, and Ms. Messina, there's really the professional practices discipline database, which contains all concluded cases against any certificated employee in the state of Florida, whether it be administrative or instructional. The certification database is the database where there may be pending issues and there is a hold on any certification action that the certification office may take. So there is a hold there, and we check those two sites. With regard to records requests of a school district, and Mr. Hardy and Dr. Vogel has mentioned this, technically and legally, a request for a personnel file, the requestor should expect any and all records, regardless of maintenance of those records, whether they be electronic, whether they be hard copy. A personnel file is the file, regardless of what documents, where they may be maintained, regardless of if it is a previous investigative issue or not. So legally, districts are required when public records requests are made to provide any and all documents. And as Dr. Vogel mentioned, we have really emphasized to districts where we're requesting these files that it is all files, including investigative files. So that request is very broad-reaching.
Eric?
Yeah, I didn't say anything yet. So my next question is, I don't know if it's for Art, if Art can help me answer this question, Mr. Vogel. You guys keep saying personnel file. Is there anything that we would want to know about a person that is exempt from public record? Is there, if somebody was asking something, maybe it's not in the personnel file, maybe there's some other document that I'm not aware of, because I'm a school board member, I don't get down into the weeds like Ms. Sucker always says. Is there some information about an individual that would be exempt from public record?
I'd say, for instance, an ongoing investigation.
Well, no, anything. I don't want to.
That's what came to me off the top of my head. The things that are exempt from public records in a personnel file would be, medical records or social security number or things like that. But the thing that I would think the board would be interested in would be an ongoing investigation. Concluded investigations are public records. Ongoing investigations would not be. We know from what I just heard this morning that there are no ongoing professional practices investigations. If there are ongoing investigations just within the district, we would not necessarily get records of that, although I would think that's something that phone calls and searches that I'm sure all of you intend to do, if you haven't already, of newspaper articles and such, would likely uncover.
So ongoing investigation is the only thing that would be exempt from public records?
No, there are lots of things that are exempt from public records, like medical records and social security numbers, and I can't give you the whole list off the top of my head.
Anything that would be pertinent in the hiring of an individual?
I would think that the thing that would be pertinent would be ongoing investigations.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add to that too, and that is a complicated issue because there is litigation going on throughout the state in a lot of places, and there's investigations that are current. So there may be some ongoing investigations where those applicants can't really comment on those because of ongoing litigation. So that's another complicated part of this whole process, but I'm not sure how we can address that. I appreciate you bringing that up. And maybe Mr. Hardy can comment on it too, but that's the difficult part.
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be reference checks. You know, I'm sure board members will call your colleagues or others in areas and get conversations, have conversations with them about the various candidates. I would think that would be the best way, and newspaper articles. I think that would be the best way to become aware of things that are currently ongoing.
Some people pick the wings off of a fly.
Okay.
Who is that speaking? Oh, Carolyn, could you maybe mute your thing when you're not talking?
I will stop talking.
Pardon me?
I won't talk quietly.
Just mute, because we could overhear that. Is there anything else on the background check investigation?
That was, I appreciate that coming up, and I think hopefully with Mr. Robinson, a board member now, when you see everything, information that we have done, that will be satisfactory.
Surely.
Jane?
Excuse me if I've got this wrong, but I thought the last time we did the superintendent search that our Human Resource Department took a more active role in this whole process of background checks and so forth than we're doing this time. Is that correct, Bill?
Actually, we are working with your Human Resources Department in these ways. And first, Al has requested the records. It works out far better if the school district does the records request than FSBA, because they have the relationships and they get the records back. So we're working with them in that regard. We also, as I indicated, are working with them on the professional practices checks. So the major difference in working with the HR department this time and last time was the last time they received the applications, and this time we are. So we are still working with them in that way. And when the board makes their final decision, it will be pending the individual going through all of the processes in human resources that every other employee would have to have, including drug testing, fingerprinting, and if anything else comes up on that. I think, Andrea, you had something?
I did, and this is, I think, specifically speaking to Mr. Robinson's question, and that is when any employer, forget that you're a school district, but when any employer contacts someone's previous employer, there are some pieces of information that they're willing to give, and then there are some pieces that they're hesitant to give because there are some legal implications if they misrepresent something. And so you specifically asked the question, is there something about a candidate that potentially we wouldn't get in a personnel file? And so I would say rumor, innuendo, gossip, certainly, because people are not going to share that when we call and talk to board members and talk to superintendents and people to whom these candidates report. They're not going to share rumor, they're not going to share gossip, they're not going to share innuendo, because those have legal implications if you share them about an applicant for a job. So the only thing they will share by law to protect themselves are facts and things that are, specifically documented, things that they can prove. So I did just want to kind of close out that piece because you specifically asked, are there things that we might not find out? And I would say potentially there could be if they fall in the category of gossip, innuendo, and rumor without any facts.
Bridget?
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the ongoing investigations as probably being the most difficult part of this. And so from the experience from the last time, as a board member, that's challenging when, as a fiduciary, we have, if any circumstance, if there's an ongoing investigation or litigation, just ensuring that you are, if you were to address that, you doing it in a way that doesn't compromise or expose further exposure to the district or the individual. I know that was a challenge in the last search because that particular person was an employee of our district with whom we are fiduciaries of as a board. The difference at this point, and I know as we do our research, in the event there is an ongoing investigation of sorts at the administrative level, and nothing was flagged at the state level through the due diligence, and we ask the candidate about such issues because we are unable to access things, recognizing they may be limited to that. I think that at that point, if there is concern, we will have to make a judgment call at that point because we have limited information. And so that, because I don't know how we would get around that. And so, I mean, perhaps that individual will, and again, this is just kind of hypothetical in a broader sense, if there's something that we're unable to obtain hard documentation but are aware of, aside from what Ms. Messina said as, rumors or innuendos, but truly things that are more substantial that we have concerns about, and I believe it's our responsibility to directly address those before any kind of hiring is concluded, and they're unable to respond to that, then I think it's incumbent upon us to evaluate it at that given time and see if that precludes us from moving forward with that individual candidate. But I will double up with, I don't want to find ourselves in a position where we were in previous time. And so whatever we can do to ensure that that doesn't happen, I certainly share that concern, but I also recognize the limitations.
Correct, thank you. And I think you brought up something. The unique situation the last time was the individual was actually an employee in the district and was hired, in the district and worked in the district for several years. So that was a unique situation.
But as a follow-up, and I apologize, many of our candidates, we're getting personnel records from all of the locations of employment, not their most recent place of hire.
We have requested it just from the most recent.
Perhaps that may be something, because again, if we go back and reflect and lessons learned, especially because there are some with his, and I don't know how long those records may be retained at the, okay, forever.
That's a good suggestion.
So perhaps we can do that, so we have a more thorough process and double check because, and that's multi-state as well, so.
Yes, that is a very good idea. And
the only kind I have.
Good conversation, because all of us working together, we're going to figure this thing out.
Yeah, and we'd like to think that the current district has contained within it the previous districts, but to your point,
yes,
Ms. Nigler, it's possible that something didn't get included.
I see my friend Al has joined in here. So Al, I know you've heard that. I'm heading over your way after this meeting.
Well,
so
and I remember the last time there were rumors and innuendo, and to try to clear up the rumors and innuendo, an investigation was done.
Yeah.
And it came back with a conclusion, and I think the board members were told, well, this came back that he was not at fault, and we should not be including that in our decision making, but it didn't seem to matter after the fact anyway, because even though the board wasn't supposed to be holding that against him, the public still did. So, I think even when you get an investigation where legally, if somebody is found not guilty, if somebody is found not guilty in an investigation, legally, we can't hold that against them, but we know that the public still can. And whether we use that or not is probably up to our individual purposes, but maybe keep that in the back of your mind when you're making these decisions. Can we move on to the interview schedules and timeline?
Yes. John, back to you on this one.
What I'd like to suggest, Don, we've got the tight timeline, and I see if we've got 3 candidates left, I think the 6 to 7:30 p.m. works fine. But if we go to 4 candidates or 5 candidates, I don't see how the 6 to 7:30 works. And I'm wondering if we could add 15 minutes if we've got 4 candidates and add a half hour if we've got 5, so that there's at least an hour in between. We're looking at the timeline for the superintendent, the finalists when we're doing the interviews. This is the draft, the finalist interview schedule. I guess I'm jumping forward to the July 1st instead of July 23rd. Maybe we go June 23rd. We'll go back to June 23rd if you want.
On the interview schedule?
Yes.
Okay. And you're looking at adding time on the Wednesday, July 1st or the Thursday, July 2nd?
On the 1st, where the candidates will go from here after we've interviewed them to where they will be going for the public questions. You know, we end up at 4:45 and then they start at 6. There's an hour and 15 minutes, but then it goes, we end up at 4:45 with 4, I guess maybe at the 4 we can still go to 6, but when we go to 5:30, I would like to see that interview then start at 6:30, because I think that half hour in between is probably too soon. So if we do
Okay.
end up with 5, change that to 6:30.
Yes, ma'am. That would not be a problem.
I apologize because I don't have the document in front of me. And it's fine, but I just, in total, when we're doing the interview, this is when they're in person in front of the board? Is that what we're
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sorry. I have way too many papers, as you see how many binders we have today, but, so I apologize. But,
This is after the group interview, when they go over to the education.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
Mitzi, your mic isn't on.
okay, so I thought, but what concerned me was I thought you were saying we only had 15 minutes to interview. Okay, that's all. That's
Oh, no, we
was like,
still have all of our time.
All right.
It's that time between when we finish up our interviews and then they go over to
Got it.
STC for the
can see.
interviews with the public. I think we need an hour to let them, you know,
I think they'll need time to actually get it set up, because they'll be here televising.
and then, yeah, they
and
need
then
the
they have to
setup
go over
time.
there. Yeah.
And plus, I think the person needs time to take a break and perhaps even eat.
Madam Chair, just so you know, Mr. Flowery and I had a conversation earlier this week to kind of walk through the day of filming and how that might work. And just so you know, what we would do is the first person that we would have for that interview would have been the first person you interviewed much earlier in the day. And the last person you interview at the end of the day would be the last person in the interview. So that person, the last person the board interviews, would not come in until hour and a half.
Well, there's time for the person to do the interviews, but also we have setup times, and I don't know if we can do it in half an hour.
As long as John is
I'll let Mr.
comfortable.
Flowery make that call.
Yeah, as long as John's comfortable, John Flowery is comfortable.
He's comfortable with doing it in half an hour?
I don't know, I mean, if Andrew's
Well,
had a
we can
conversation
discuss
with
that at the next, on the 23rd, get some feedback on if they need that time. Eric?
Will these people be meeting with like the school-based administrators, the union, there are C-level staff? Or this will be the only meetings they'll be doing?
Okay. They, the staff, the district level staff will be taking them on the tours. And Mitzi, you want to talk a little bit about how that's going to work?
So sure, while they're interviewing with you in a group setting, the other.
Mitzi, talking to the
I can't
mic
hear
instead
you.
of...
For me. So while the candidates are having their group interview, the other candidates will be with a member of superintendent's cabinet, a member of SBA, so a principal and a district level administrator, along with whoever they've brought with them, a spouse or whomever. And they will go on a tour of the district. This also keeps them away from a television and being able to see what the other candidates are saying during their interview process. But it gives them an opportunity to connect with our staff also. And that'll happen on Thursday. Then on Friday, during your one-on-one interviews, there's time between each interview for each one of you. So we would designate a particular staff member to then take them around and introduce them to the staff here, at least at the landings. And then I would hope that we would have an opportunity for whoever you're selecting to then come in and meet with the union and with school-based administrators, the principals, and then the district leaders.
So the finalists will be able to meet with the union, the school-based administrators, and the principals? Is that what she said?
No.
And,
Yeah.
well, right, that would be selected.
So
They
the
would be,
final, the person who got the job?
Well, correct. I'm just trying to, in the timeline that you have, which is 2 days, I'm not sure when we would have time for them to be able to meet with them. They have a pretty packed calendar as it is. I mean, we could set it up as part of the tour process, that instead they meet with all of the school-based administrators as part of that process, but it just makes for a very long interview day for that candidate. They're interviewing with you and then interviewing with school-based administrators, interviewing with district-based administrators. Now, on Friday, there is a lunch where everyone will come back together. We could invite you.
Friday or Thursday?
Friday. Thursday, they will be out with whomever they're with on their bus during the course of the day, either before their interview or after their interview.
We show they come in on Tuesday the 30th.
Right.
On Wednesday the 1st.
Correct.
We do the interviews, and then Thursday the 2nd is when we do the one-on-one.
Correct. And that would be
So they're going to be here an extra day?
Yeah, they will leave on Friday. They will stay Thursday night.
I see.
So they'll leave on Friday. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant Thursday, when you all will be together.
That's what I thought you
for
meant.
A lunch. We could invite the union leadership to come over as well and meet the candidates. I'm just not sure how we could fit in basically 2 interview days, enough time for them to meet with all of the school-based administration and all of the district level administrators and teachers or others.
Mr. Vogel.
Yes. Last time we did have a luncheon. It was sponsored by the Teachers Association, and it was successful, I thought. And all the candidates were in the room together, and they introduced themselves, and they had some social time during lunch. So if that would be something we could do, we could include that on that Thursday.
That's when you're doing your one-on-one.
One-on-one.
And the union can sit in
Yes.
here.
Right.
They can physically be here and watch us as we interview the 5 candidates. The 5 board members individually interview each candidate. And then also that night at STC.
Well, at STC, you'll be in a television studio, so it'll be.
Oh, they're going to be at the studio. Okay.
Correct. We, in the past, the last time we had that big gathering at Riverview, we can't have that large of a gathering. So instead, we're asking the community to send their questions in, and then Andrea was going to compile those to ask the candidates if we only received a few, or to garner themes if we receive many.
Well,
And then
perhaps
interview
on
each
Thursday,
candidate.
when we finish up with the one-on-one interviews at 3:45 is the latest that I'm seeing, perhaps on Thursday afternoon, like, 4 o'clock.
That we would.
If we could fit in a meeting with the union and the,
We can only have gatherings of 50 people or less, so it would.
well,
have to
I'm not
be-
asking for the whole union to be there, but, I mean, perhaps when we've got the schedule where they're meeting one-on-one with us, if we could add a time there that they would go across the street then and interview with SCTA. Like on Thursday, July 2nd, we've got candidate A at 8:30, candidate C at 1:30, and then candidate B at 2:45, if it's 3. I mean, if there's a time in there that, like even after it at 4 o'clock, candidate A or B or C, or if they could meet.
So you would want them to meet with all 3 of them concurrently?
Or 5. Okay.
If there were 5, so if there are 5 of them, you're done. If you were to have 5 candidates on Thursday, you would be done with your, I don't know how 5 of them you're done earlier, but, so say 3:45, and then you would want them to meet with the union, because they're meeting with each of you individually, so nobody's going to get done any earlier on Thursday. They're all
Right.
going to finish at the same time. So then you'd want them to meet with the union
Well,
as a group,
I'm
as a
not sure,
collective?
how they might want to do that, or maybe you could
Okay.
look into that.
Okay.
Bill?
Okay, yes. The luncheon, I think we passed through that. Is everybody okay with the teachers' union sponsoring the luncheon on Thursday and interacting there? And what we
Well,
could,
and that would give the candidates time to go home that night without a
Association, yeah.
problem.
No, I mean,
Okay.
somebody might want to check with them.
I know,
Yeah.
right, we would have to ask them.
right. But I've had some ongoing conversations with the Teacher Association leadership.
Okay.
But then what we can do is the last time.
If they don't want to do it, I'll pay for the luncheon and just invite them.
Okay. What we'll do is this: we can work on the format of that meeting a little bit different than we had. So we will engage them through that luncheon. I'm not sure on Thursday afternoon, if whatever the board wants to do, we can talk about that. But it could be challenging if we have 5 to expand that afternoon out. But what I'm hearing is we're going to kind of leave that on hold right now. We will communicate with the Teachers Association president or executive director and then find out how we can work with them. But you're right. They're going to be, all these interviews on Wednesday are open to the public, and we can invite the Administrative Association to sit in on those meetings. One thing that Mrs. Messina is going to say is about the questions that they might have. Go ahead, Mrs. Messina. I know what you're going to say.
Actually, I don't think you do, but I do.
Ooh,
I
damn.
think I do. I think I do.
I have a thought, though, that might make some sense, and it has to do with the time over at STC.
Okay.
So let's just say you have 3 groups. You've got your Administrators Association, your Teachers Association, and your Support Association, and I think that would include all the people you're talking about. You could potentially have 3 rooms at the STC in addition to the studio part where I'll be. And so the candidates could technically so we'll call it 5 segments because we're going to assume there's 5 interviewees. Then whoever's interviewing with me would be with me. One person would be with one of the groups, one would be with another, one would be with another. You could limit it to 10 representatives from each of those groups. They could each have separate rooms so that the social distancing takes place. And then every 20 minutes, we just kind of rotate so that they work through those groups as well as the public interview with me. That just seems like it might make a little bit of sense. I don't know what others are thinking, and I don't even know if STC has 3 rooms that might make some sense for. So we'd have interviewee, green room, group A, group B, group C, and they all just kind of rotate through that cycle.
Right. But I'd just like to be able to have before you do the interview with somebody, to let them have a few minutes so that it's not backed up 1-to-1. I mean, so that person who's coming on is not in the room with anybody interviewing them before they see you, so that there's at least a break in there. Mm-hmm. But it looks like that's probably a good solution.
Yeah.
I like
Bill.
it.
I really like that, and again, that's so good about talking through these. There actually is there's one association that represents all of the employees.
Right.
So that would be 2 groups, Mr. Messina. We could go ahead and work through that, and that's a great idea. And that was not what I thought you were going to say. Okay, good. We'll look at that.
All right.
All right.
We're running a little behind schedule, so let's see if we can get, is there anything else on the interview schedules and the timeline? The finalist process.
Great discussion. Andrea, back to you on this one.
I'm sorry, which part here? are you asking?
Finalist process. We can talk more about that on the 23rd, but if you just want to maybe give them a thumbnail on that.
Yeah, I think most of you actually watched the CAC meeting that we had last week where they came to their consensus. And so what we would recommend is following a very similar format, which is to say there are 5 semifinalists. We start with the first semifinalist, which is candidate number 7, and we talk about here are the strengths of candidate number 7, here are the things, thoughts, wonderings, and strengths of that candidate. Then we go to the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, so that the board has a full conversation about each of the 5 semifinalists. Then we could go back through and start again. We could run through that cycle as many times as the board wants before somebody makes a motion. I move that we determine candidates so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so are our finalists and invite them for interviews. So what we would do is get the conversation out there first. concerns, questions that you might have as well. And then after all the conversation has occurred, we would move to an expectation of somebody making a motion.
Andrea, I think rather than somebody making a motion and say, well, these are the three, I liked the way you did it with the committee where each one gave their top 5, or if we gave, in this instance, if each one gave their top 3, and then let's see what those numbers look like before we move forward, rather than having one person saying these are the 3, because it could then get complicated, and narrow it down that way, rather than one person making a motion that you vote yes or no. You might like 2 of them, but not the third one. And then, I mean, there's just so many ways that we could be making motions before we got down to the top 3. Bridget?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I appreciate this comment. Actually, Mrs. Brown, I think we even talked about this at a prior meeting of when we get down to the final list date, whether that be 3 or 5 or 4, how that discussion takes place, I think is where we're talking about, it being more of a dialogue than, one board member go to, here are the 3 reasons I like X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z, and boom, this is who I'm putting my weight behind. I think if you looked and watched the CAC, there was more of an organic discussion about, and where we won't necessarily be weeding it out. Maybe at the next meeting, if after we see the questions video and read their responses to the 5 questions, perhaps that's where we'll maybe changing the number of who will be finally reviewing and interviewing, if you will. But when we get to and maybe that's something we can talk about once how many we have, depending on what happens next, right. And then going, but just kind of preparing for the final date, the final decision. And I believe that's where Andrea was. And I may be wrong, but I thought that's where she was going is, in a similarity as his comparison is just verbalizing and working as a board of sharing the positive elements of whoever our finalists are, so that you have a sense before we finally put our weight behind one particular candidate, that we had the opportunity to hear everyone's thoughts so that we can build consensus and support our next superintendent.
And that's really exactly what I was getting ready to say, was that I'm not comfortable asking board members to limit it to 3 at this point, since you only have 5. I think what we would want, and I appreciate, because we typically do use that matrix where board members say, these are the candidates I would like to continue to consider. And it might be 2, it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be all 5, whichever. It doesn't have to be you're only allowed to give us 3. We prefer to kind of leave it open. Who would you like to continue to consider? Then we can look at the numbers. And to your point, there might be somewhere all 5 people. There could be 3 candidates that all 5 of you would like to continue to consider. So then we kind of say, all right, is everyone okay inviting these 3? Yes, let's move them off the table. Now we have 2 other candidates. One might have 4 votes, one might have 3 votes. What do you want to do with these 2 candidates? Do you want to bring them in for an interview as well? And some of you would say, well, if at least a majority of my colleagues wants to interview that person, I think we should bring them in. Or you might say, nope, let's just stick with the ones that have the unanimous vote. We can kind of have that conversation, which is, I think, what Bridget's referencing, the organic part of it. We start with the ones there where there's clear agreement, confirm that, yep, we're going to bring them in, and then we talk about how we're going to handle the other ones. But I personally am not comfortable saying only the top 3 unless the board tells us that that's what they want.
Yeah.
Anyone else on that? Bill?
We can talk more about that next meeting also.
On the 23rd.
And the only thing that we really are always concerned with is ranking candidates, where you have, I'm going to rank one, because the ranking sometimes, and if people do that, it can cause a problem.
Well, yeah, I like the way that you did it with the CAC.
Yeah.
They just said, okay, here's my 5.
Got it.
Or here's my 10, or whatever it was.
Good. Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to the contract.
Art.
I think there are a couple of issues, and I know that you have, I think the time for this item is up, and we have other people who are going to be coming in on the Kroll update. So my suggestion would be the contract's going to, depending on the board, take a little while. We could push that to the 23rd if that's what the board would like to do, so we don't have our consultants waiting for us. I would make two other points very briefly. One is the board will vote formally at your meeting this afternoon, based on what I've heard, to accept the list from the committee, those 5 individuals, and
As semifinalists.
name them as the semifinalists. So that'll be final action, formal action that you take today. I would also like to point out that the committee, as you all have said, and I would like to chime in too, because I watched, did great work, and thank you to the 2 representatives for the rest of your group, and that they have now fulfilled their function, and so the committee would now be discharged. So there is no longer a committee. They've done all that the board has asked them to do, so they can now talk to each other once again, should they choose to do so, about these matters. They are no longer a committee of the board.
Do we have to formally disband them?
No, I don't think you do. I'm just pointing that out to all of you because you formed them for a particular task,
Right.
and they have completed that task. So I think they are now no longer a committee. Just have fond memories.
And shout out to Mrs. Tompkins for a lot of the administrative support you did throughout that
Yeah.
process, so
Very
thank you.
happy.
Absolutely.
She's in the house.
One thing I'd like to bring up on the contract when we come back is the leave schedule. I'd like to see it more closely mirror what other 12-month employees have, and perhaps that information can be brought forward when we discuss it on the 23rd.
Great.
Eric?
Well, since we're bringing things up, I would like to see the goals come back that we had in the original Bowdoin contract.
What do you mean the goals?
The goals that he got a bonus based upon the Brown plan, raising the quartile, the lowest.
Yeah, but those are goals the goals don't get set in the contract. Per the contract, the goals get set by the board and the superintendent after the superintendent is hired.
So you didn't have in there that he got a bonus based upon receiving certain metrics? That was not part of the contract, Mr. Hardy?
That is part
On
of this
page
contract.
3.
He just said
should
it's
be.
part of the contract. I'm sorry.
It's in here.
But the actual $15,000 bonus and what they are?
Well, what we've got in here is because you had it for a while and then you didn't have it. So to me, it's an open question, does the board want that? Assuming the board wants that, you're going to have to decide how much money you're putting toward that, which is a blank left
Right.
in the contract. And then the way I would suggest it be set up is that you have this out there as a potential for the superintendent to earn, but that annually the board and the superintendent set the goals. Right.
Art, please speak up.
I'm sorry. The question on goals is in paragraph 5B of the draft contract. It has a provision for setting performance goals. So the board has to decide, A, do you want that? Assuming you do, you have to tell me, B, how much money do you want to put to it? And then my recommendation would be that you don't set specific goals in this contract, but you set the mechanism for setting goals in the contract, and that's something that's worked out between the superintendent and the school board, with ultimately the school board having the control over what those goals are. But that's a subject to discuss.
And that'll be discussed on the 23rd, as we are a little past our allotted time. And I want to again thank FSBA and all the work that you've done, and again, our committee. They've done a wonderful job. But we've got 5 good candidates coming forward, and we're going to have to get those down to 3 to 1 or whatever, and move forward. But this is going to be the tough part moving forward. But I'm pleased with what we have. The next, we've already given you the questions to ask. We did that previously, correct? So we all know
Yes,
the
ma'am.
questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, and the Kroll update. Now, do we have to give you those, or do we do those as we're going?
You're going to give us 3.
Oh, so we're going to have to put the questions we're going to ask the 5 in place before the meeting. Okay. All right. Okay.
I'm not following, I'm sorry.
The finalist questions that we ask as board members, we already identified which category we're asking, but the actual questions we're asking, when will you need those particular questions?
Thank you. That's going to end up being just before the interviews. So the interviews would be on July the, let's see, that's July the 1st. So I would probably want to communicate with each of you somewhere around the 25th, 26th. And the reason I need to have them is so that what I like to do, and I think those of you who were on the board before, I like to give you sort of a little sheet where you can take notes, and you have each of the questions that each of your peers are asking with a little space for comments, so that you can take copious notes as you're going through the interview. Turn the page, turn the page, turn the page. So I just need that to compile that document to help you all for your note taking throughout the interview.
So we only go for one question? What if, and if they said if there's time, we add questions, or should we put 2?
No, you should actually probably prepare about 5.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
In each of your categories.
Thank you. I'll give them time to clear out, and
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you, committee members.
And now on the agenda, we have the Kroll update, and that is the report on the harassment statutes, policies. You know, while we're doing this, I'd like to bring up a point that is actually in the proposed policies, and that is the policy 2.70 bullying, and on page 53 in our books, the item 15, and that's the review of the policy, and it says, the district shall involve students, parents, teachers, administrators, school staff, school volunteers, community representatives, and local law enforcement agencies in the process of adopting and revising bullying and harassment policies. And we're putting forth all of these policies without much input. I guess we're going to, you know, advertise them, but you know, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable discussing them and advertising them the same day, you know, to make changes, but because I think there's some changes I'd like to see made in them, but we'll go through the discussion. Who's going to be leading that? Is that Al, or is that Art?
Oh, well, good morning. Good morning. So thank you for the opportunity. So I think we have Al, and I think we have Mr. Ellers and his team on here from Kroll. Am I right?
Or technical issue, I guess we're holding on. But
We don't see Mr. Ellers. Al was on, but now he's not, so.
Right, while they're finding Mr. Ellers, who I'm
There
sure
he
will
is.
be joining us.
Here's that.
I'm on the phone with Mark trying to figure it out. Give me
You're
just
on.
a second.
I
Okay.
resent him the link.
So let me set the stage for you, perhaps. As the board recalls, you hired the Kroll group to review our policies related to equity and commission them to give you both a review and, perhaps most importantly, some new proposed policies and procedures that fit with best practices. So that's the document that you've got in front of you. Mr. Mark Ellers and perhaps other members of his team will be on to discuss these with you. These are their recommendations, their policies. So to the extent you have questions, I and staff can try to help, but they're really coming from Kroll, and those questions need to be directed toward them. I would suggest to you, with respect to a timeline, which is more our issue than Kroll's issue, is the thought was we would advertise these policies today so that they could be approved in July, so that they would be formal policies of the board by the end of July, when staff is coming back and before students come back.
You're coming up, Mark.
Okay. So that they can be trained on them.
Kendra and Monica to do the same
Before the school year starts. So that's the timing that we were hopeful for, but obviously that's up to the board. But we don't want to, we would like to train people before the school year starts, but we can only train people on policies that exist.
Well, and I'm sorry.
Bridget?
And I'm sorry, Jane. I agree. I understand our timeline, and I recognize us unanimously highlighted and emphasized the importance of training. And I'm very excited to go through this, but I also shared a similar concern overall, as Mrs. Brown just mentioned. And if I were to have to weigh them, it would be if it's a delay by a couple of weeks or what have you, but to be in alignment with the recommendations, and the impact is to be able to talk through it, make sure we understand and can work through all of that, and then perhaps bump the actual final policy advertisement to a future date. So just wanted to share my opinion on that too.
Jane?
Well, I read through these policies and suggestions and recommendations, and, they're the professional. We're paying them a lot of money for this, and I think we're already behind on our deadline to get this started the first of the year. I have some concerns about personnel. I have some concerns about who does this at every school, but I'm sure those can be worked out. I think that, they've done a fabulous job. I read through these and I'm going, wow, are we really behind the 8 ball in terms of what we had before? And I think whatever you think about our past, some of the problems we had last year reflected in the poor policies that we had. And I would say they were not very good and not very explicit and not very complete. So, and there are many things from these policies that will cause us to change, like our student code of conduct, some of the other things that we will have to, and of course there's many things that are going to cause the student code of conduct to be changed, I think, with coming back to school and all of the reentry. But I think that this is a great step. I think it's a wonderful job, and I'm very, very excited about this.
Okay, now, Caroline?
Yes, I read through these also, and I hear what you're saying, Shirley, about having input. But I think if we put these out and for advertisement, we will get the input that we need, or that you're looking for. And Jane is 100% correct. We've paid a lot of money to have these policies put in place, and I would like them to be enforced, or I would like our people to be trained on them during the summer when we do our training. And the only way to do that is to approve these and put them out now for advertising. And we recognize that we have a whole month before we finalize the report.
Okay, well, let's have Kroll give their report, and then I know that if we get comments and we make changes, we have to re-advertise, and then it's another month. But let's have the report presentation, and then we'll have our comments. Kroll?
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us. And just so you know, I see Monica Monticello and now Kendra Waldsmith, my colleagues who work with me on the report, and the proposed policies are on the line as well. Again, thank you for having us, and we're delighted to be here to hopefully answer whatever questions you have and address any concerns you have. I thought what I would do was briefly just kind of highlight a few of our key findings that we found based on our review, our discussions with district staff, our review of your existing policies, as well as our best practices research, and then kind of lead into the policies themselves that we're proposing. So based on our review and research, we've identified a several areas in which we think the district's equity policies and procedures need improvement. And we've developed a set of new and revised policies and procedures for your consideration. Now, these proposed policies incorporate feedback we received from district staff back in May, and they also have tried to incorporate, and we actually had to make some last-minute changes as a result of the new Title IX regulations, which were published by the Department of Education on May 4th, on May 6th, and those regulations become effective on August 14th. So there, and the published document was like over 1,000 pages long, but fortunately we were able to focus primarily on the key provisions, and they had some shorter highlight provisions that I think had the most important ones, most of which were procedural, a few of which were substantive. But we've tried to address them in these proposed policies. So some of the key findings we make, and they're obviously outlined in the report, but first and foremost, we found that the school district's existing discrimination policies, that was policy 271, the policy against discrimination students, and policy 2.72, policy against discrimination employees applicants, do not provide much guidance on the different types of discrimination and harassment that exist, and do not adequately define the different forms of harassment, including sexual harassment. So we've tried to address those issues. We didn't feel it was necessary to have separate equity policies for employees and students, because all district community members should be subject to the same requirements on these issues. There may be some differences, and there are, in the procedural components of that and some of the reporting components, but the actual substantive prohibition against discrimination and harassment and what it applies to should apply district-wide to everyone. And in addition, in school cases, of course, you're going to have some cases that may involve a combination of students and employees. So that needs to be addressed. We also found that the current policies lack clearly defined and easy to understand procedures for how to report and investigate complaints. We found that the current procedures do not sufficiently distinguish between employment and student related complaints. There's currently a lack of written guidance concerning accommodations and supportive measures. We found that the current policies do not clearly provide that acts of retaliation constitute a separate violation of the policy that must be investigated independently. In addition, the district currently lacks a dating violence and abuse policy, which is required under Florida law. So we want to put you in compliance with that law. The current procedures for employment-related complaints didn't adequately or explicitly consider the Weingarten requirements in the complaint investigation process. So we tried to incorporate that in the procedures that we proposed. And then in addition, there currently is no one person who has clearly defined Title IX responsibilities in the district. You have an equity coordinator who certainly sort of plays that role with respect to the employment side of things, but not necessarily on the student side as well. And under the Title IX regs, actually it was even true under the old Title IX regs, but definitely under the new Title IX regs, there needs to be one person with overall responsibility for the district's Title IX and equity program, and who can serve as a resource for Title IX officers and other administrators when difficult issues arise, who can ensure that annual training occurs and can assess the needs of the district as far as that training, and also can be responsible essentially for the entire set of equity policies and procedures and their implementation. So we wanted to provide clarity on the roles of the Title IX coordinator, as well as the individual Title IX officers, which in this case are the either principal or assistant principal at each school, will play the role of Title IX officer at the school, but there should be one Title IX coordinator that's district-wide. And then we, as requested by the board, we examined the complaint forms that are currently in use for students and employees, and we've tried to propose improved forms for that are hopefully easy to use, easy to understand, easy to fill out, And as we'll discuss later, they need to be widely available both on the website and at school levels and presumably at the staff levels as well. So to address these issues and to establish a more comprehensive equity program for the district that was, what we believe was consistent with best practices, we're recommending that the board adopt the proposed set of revised and updated policies and procedures that we've provided. And there's basically essentially 3 new policies and then 1 slightly revised policy. The 3 new policies are now our proposed policy 2.71, which is the policy against discrimination and harassment. And so this policy, this new policy 271, is designed or intended to replace current policy 271, policy against discrimination students, and current policy 272, policy against discrimination employees applicants, by essentially combining them into one policy that prohibits discrimination and harassment by any member of the district community against any other member of the district community. And we believe this proposed policy will more comprehensively address sexual and other forms of harassment based on protected classes, and more clearly describe the scope and applicability of the policy, and better define and describe the behavior that's actually prohibited under the policy. The second policy we've proposed is we've labeled policy 2.71A, which is the discrimination and harassment complaint procedures. So this policy is designed to replace the district current procedures, which are in a document that's entitled Employee Applicant Students Complaint Procedure. And so our proposed procedures are to provide clarity to the complaint investigation process for all discrimination and harassment claims in the district, again, whether it's employees or students. Although we make distinctions in this document between employee and student cases where appropriate. The third proposed policy that we've provided is we've labeled policy 2.72, which would now be the student dating violence and abuse policy. And this policy is designed to supplement the policy against discrimination and harassment by addressing common forms of sexual violence that affect students primarily in grades 7 through 12. And this dating violence and abuse policy will comply with Florida law, specifically statute 1006.148, which requires Florida school districts to adopt and implement a dating violence and abuse policy. Now, the alleged violations of this policy, the dating violence and abuse policy, will be governed also by the complaint procedures of 2.71A. So you essentially have 2 substantive policy provisions, 271 and 272, that are governed by the procedures in 271A. And then finally, we've offered some pretty minor revisions to policy 2.70, which is your existing bullying and harassment policy. I mean, we found that the current bullying and harassment policy was quite robust. It seems to be working fairly well in the district. Most of the people, certainly people we spoke with, had a good understanding of it. But we felt the revisions were necessary to do really 2 things. One, to clarify the distinctions between the types of harassment addressed in the current bullying and harassment policy from sexual harassment and harassment based on a protected class. So sexual harassment and harassment based on a protected class are really addressed explicitly now in proposed policy 2.71, the policy against discrimination and harassment. And other forms of harassment, which really are just a subset of bullying, things like physical harassment, verbal harassment, not necessarily based on a protected class, that's covered by the bullying harassment policy. But if it's harassment based on a protected class, it should be primarily governed by the new 2.71, although it could arguably be a violation of both policies. And then the second thing we wanted to do with revisions was to make the bullying policy applicable to students only, which is consistent with other school districts, and it was consistent with, I think, the desires of many of the staff members we talked to there had been some confusion as to why it necessarily included employees, when that policy, I think, is clearly designed to prevent student bullying and cyberbullying and so forth. And then finally, as I mentioned, we've proposed some new complaint forms. They're in Appendix A and B of our report, and they were just designed to simplify the complaint process. We believe these forms should be made available in not only all school administrative offices, they should be widely available to staff, teachers, so forth. So if someone reports, if a student, for example, to report a complaint to a teacher, it would be helpful to have, for a teacher to have a complaint form. They could sit down and you know, potentially help the student complete those forms and so forth. And they should also be available online on the district's website, along with obviously the policies and the procedures themselves. So those are essentially the I think what's outlined in our report. And I will ask you, I guess, what you would like me to do next. I can either, you know, kind of at a very high level, walk through the proposed policies, or simply open it up to questions. I'm not sure, you know, if what your preference is.
I think before we go to questions, we could take each policy individually, and you give an overview, and then if any members have questions on that policy, we'll go through them, and then we'll go to the next policy and follow the same procedure. Is that all right with everyone? Okay, so let's start with policy 2.71.
Yes. So, okay. So, like I said, this is the policy.
I'm going in the order that they were presented, not the numerical order.
Right. Okay. So, policy prohibiting discrimination and harassment, which would be the revised 271. If you have it in front of you, you'll see it starts with the general policy statement. That is essentially the prohibition that the policy applies to. So, in the second paragraph, it's the policy of the district to prohibit any form of discrimination and harassment based on an individual's race, color, religion, ethnic, natural origin, and so forth, listing essentially the protected classes in the policy. And it states that the school system will act to promptly investigate all complaints, whether formal or informal, and whether verbal or written, of discrimination and harassment. And then at the end, we've added a provision, which this just seemed like the most logical place to put it. We felt it was an important provision to put in. A lot of school districts kind of ignore this aspect, even though it's kind of common sense and most people agree with it, but it's not necessarily written in policy. And that's simply to make clear that it's the policy of the district that all district employees and adult community members are prohibited from entering into or attempting to form romantic or sexual interactions with any student enrolled in the district. And so that just became part of this policy. It seems like a logical place to put it. It obviously could be placed somewhere else if you felt differently. The second section then is the scope of the policy. This is essentially what the policy applies to, and it makes clear that in this case, this policy will apply to all members of the district community and to all forms of discrimination and harassment that are committed either by or against a member of the community when the conduct occurs either on school property or during or in relation to a school-sponsored program or activity, regardless of location. Applicability of Title IX is just kind of a general provision just to indicate that Title IX applies obviously to the school district as it receives federal funds. And then there's the role of the Title IX coordinator. So this is and this actually section I think is repeated in one or two of the other, at least one of the other policies. But it indicates that the Title IX coordinator is the person who will be designated by the superintendent to coordinate compliance with Title IX and the district's equity policies. The Title IX coordinator will be the person who will receive reports or complaints from employees of employment-related discrimination and harassment, and will then ensure that any investigation is conducted by an impartial investigator. It might be the Title IX coordinator doing the investigation, or it'll be someone that is designated by the coordinator to do the investigation. The Title IX coordinator will also be responsible for collecting and maintaining essentially all complaints and all investigation reports and all resolutions of claims and complaints under these policies, whether by students or employees, essentially to be a central repository for those places as far as filing and maintaining records going forward. The Title IX coordinator will also be responsible for assessing the training needs of the district's students and employees, and will annually report to the board on the use and efficacy of the policy. The section role of Title IX officer just indicates that that the Title IX officer is essentially a school by school position. So it's generally going to be either the principal or assistant principal, or possibly a designee from each school who will serve in the role of Title IX officer. And so essentially at the school, the Title IX officer is like a mini Title IX coordinator for that school. And they will receive reports and complaints from students regarding violations of the policy. They'll ensure that an investigation is conducted by an impartial investigator. Again, it may be that person, the Title IX officer, him or herself, or someone he or she designates. And then the Title IX officer will be responsible for making sure that at the end of the resolution, the paperwork, the report, the investigation, complaints, and so forth are submitted to the Title IX coordinator so that they can keep track of these outcomes. So the next section, which goes on then for several pages, is the various definitions of the types of harassment and other terms that are used throughout these policies, a much more expanded definition of sexual harassment, many examples of sexual harassment, the hope being that this will be not just a policy document, but essentially an educational and prevention document. Because I think the more people really become aware of what exactly is sexual harassment, what exactly is other forms of harassment, it can have a prevention and proactive component to it.
I have a quick question. I just want to, before we go ahead. The Title IX coordinator is designated by the superintendent, as it's written here, and then at the school level, and I understand the Title IX coordinator is required to have the appropriate training to have that designation. Is training required also of the school level coordinator? I don't know if I'm right.
Yes.
And I think we have a training and prevention provision in these proposed policies, which kind of describe a little bit further as far as, what level of training various people need. But in this, you'll see that the Title IX officer, along with the Title IX coordinator, all the Title IX officers should also receive annual training, in-person training that covers a variety of topics, including investigation and response to these complaints.
Okay, I thought I read that. I just wanted to confirm that at the coordinator and officers both, and then and I don't want to jump ahead, but I did read through all this. But the other question is, because, and this is something we had in our past policy, as it pertained, I understand that all of the officers at the district level and the coordinators at the school level, I want to make sure I'm using the right terms. Other way around? Okay. But that all of that's housed centrally, but in the event anything happens at the senior level, I know that's something that we've had prior was in the event it was the superintendent, because anything other than that. Is that addressed in?
I'm sorry, there is a place where it says the board can get an outside investigator, but let's let them go through this and hold any questions until after, because I think we not only have to go through the policy, but then the investigation procedure, and then in the appendix, there's even the forms to fill out where I have some questions too. So why don't you continue?
Okay, sure.
And what page are we on? Do you know?
So, well, I'm on, if you're looking at the entire document, which includes the report and the proposed policies, I think I'm on the bottom of page 14 going into 15. If you're looking at the individual policies, I'm not sure what pages, but it's at the bottom of the definitions. There's a section, additional violations of the policy, and it gets into retaliation, false reports, and failure to report or investigate. And this is just to this is just to highlight these things that were included in the past policy, but this just makes emphasis that these are actual separate and distinct violations of the policy. And in the case of retaliation, for example, even a respondent, for example, who's accused of some discrimination or harassment could be guilty of retaliation even in a case where the underlying claim against that person is not corroborated or substantiated. So acts of retaliation, again, they're separate violations that need to be treated as separate violations and investigated in the same fashion. False reports is, again, if a report is made in bad faith, that would be a violation in and of itself of the policy, but it doesn't incorporate merely making a report against someone that doesn't ultimately get substantiated. It has to be made in bad faith. And then failure to report and investigate is for school employees where there's a duty to adequately respond, investigate, and so forth. Their failure to do so, negligence in that respect, would be a policy violation. The provision on reporting complaints is just sort of outlining the various ways that matters can come to the attention of the district. A couple things to highlight. Any district employee who receives a complaint from a student is required to report that complaint to the school, to the Title IX officer, and if it's a school. And then any student who believes they've been the target of discrimination or harassment, they may report it to the Title IX officer or to any district employee, any teacher. It makes no difference. Obviously, they're not required to report these things, but they may. But any district employee who gets a report from a student is required to act on that and pass that along to the Title IX officer. Later on in the procedural component, we talk about mandatory report situations too. Obviously, the first thing to do if it's a mandatory report situation is to notify the appropriate authorities even before you notify anyone else. And then, detailed information regarding the informal and formal complaint procedures are found in Policy 271A. The next provision is on confidentiality. And this is trying to make clear that while the district will do what they can to respect the privacy of the parties in these instances, they can't really ever promise or provide absolute confidentiality because you have to balance confidentiality with the district's obligation to provide due process to the respondent and to conduct a thorough investigation, as well as to take necessary action to resolve the complaint. So this makes clear that the district retains the right to disclose the identity of the parties and witnesses to complaints in appropriate circumstances to people who need to know, which is going to include a respondent, the person who's actually accused of the wrongdoing, if there's going to be a formal investigation. It then makes clear that if a claimant, however, is insisting on that his or her name not be revealed to the respondent, they report the matter, but they don't want it to be disclosed to the respondent. The person who receives that information should inform the claimant of the four things in the bullet points. One, that it's going to limit the district's ability to do anything about the complaint, to respond to the complaint. It's going to prohibit that the district policy prohibits retaliation against claimants and witnesses. They're going to try to do whatever they can to prevent retaliation, and the district will take strong responsive action if retaliation occurs. So these are things you advise a claimant if they're insisting on confidentiality, so that they know that, and then they can make an informed decision as to whether they want to reconsider whether they do or don't want to maintain that level of confidentiality. And then if the claimant still requests confidentiality after being given that notice, the staff person or the investigator should inform the claimant that the district will not be able to proceed with a formal investigation under those circumstances. Okay, then there's provisions about anonymous reports, which basically will be accepted, but may obviously impact the ability to effectively investigate them. The immunity provision is standard, just to make clear that anyone who in good faith reports an act of discrimination or harassment to a school official is immune from any cause of damages, and that's just pursuant to Florida law. The amnesty provision is just to indicate that if it doesn't want to discourage anyone from coming forward with a complaint under the policy simply because they would also potentially have to admit maybe another policy violation like drug or alcohol use. So for limited purposes of making a report under this policy and trying to respond to the complaint, the individual cannot get into trouble for doing so. Options for assistance and supportive measures. Supportive measures is sort of the new term that's used in the new Title IX regs. It used to be, we would refer to it as maybe interim measures. These are the immediate measures you might take when there's a complaint of harassment or discrimination for the safety and well-being of the claimant. Anything from altering academic or bus schedules or moving lockers or whatever needs to be done to kind of address the immediate situation before you've had a chance to fully investigate and resolve the matter. And but we also, and this again is from the new Title IX regs, it's important to ensure that whatever supportive measures are taken, they can't be punitive or disciplinary. They must be non-punitive and non-disciplinary, and they must be not unreasonably burdensome to the other party, unless there's an immediate or serious threat to the community. We then address education, training, and acknowledgement of policy. So here's where we talk about training. So all students need to be informed of the policy. They should be informed of the policy in the student handbook, on the district website, in student registration materials. We suggest a poster summarizing the policy should be posted in a prominent location in each school. I believe there's a department in the state of Florida that assists with that. And age-appropriate curriculum materials should be made available so that students can be educated about the policies and recognize and report discrimination and harassment. Each employee should be required to annually sign an acknowledgement certification form, which acknowledges that they've read and understand and agree to abide by the policy, but their failure to do so does not affect their ability to, or their obligation to comply with the policy. Employees should also receive annual compliance training on the policy, and that school administrators who are responsible for these policies, which would include obviously the Title IX coordinator, the Title IX officers, perhaps HR department at in the district level and so forth, they should be they should receive substantive in-person training on an annual basis. Other school personnel and employees should receive some type of training, but I think there's more flexibility built in as to how that is. It could be an online course, a video presentation, or other means. And again, it would be the Title IX coordinator who would be in the best position to kind of assess the most effective way to implement that each year. The Title IX coordinators, officers, the personnel tasked with implementing the procedures, again, Title IX coordinator and officers, investigators, they should be trained at least annually, and it should include but not be limited to remedy, how to remedy, investigate, render findings, determine appropriate sanctions, and so forth. Also discuss confidentiality and privacy, and regulatory guidance. The Equal Employment Opportunity Policy Statement was taken from your prior policy. I don't think we changed that at all. And then the rest of the provisions, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. So that is proposed policy 2.71. Are there any questions about that, or would you like me to go on to the
Complaint Procedures 271A.
Eric?
Overarching questions. I saw in the protected classes you don't have veteran status. Was there a reason why that was left off?
That's a good question. It may have.
I've seen other places where veteran status has been.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were probably thinking that, at least looking at the student side of things, that we didn't think veteran status would be an applicable position, but for the employment side, it obviously is. That's a good question. Let me ask either Monica or Kendra if they recall that issue, or if you've seen what you've seen in the other policies that we've looked at.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what it was, Mark. We were streamlining with what you had before and other Florida policies in terms of the protected classes they listed. So this was pretty much inclusive of the standard list, but that is something we could certainly add.
As a veteran who ended up getting called up in the reserves from the first Gulf War, I think it's important.
We'll have to, I'm sorry, if we're going to be adding the veteran status, I guess I'll ask Art to provide, because we're going to be voting on this afternoon, and we'll need to add that to the policy we're voting on. Is that correct, Art?
If you're going to be voting on something this afternoon and you're going to make amendments to this, we'll have to at least reference that in the vote.
So would you would like them to make an amendment?
I would like you to make an amendment to include veteran status.
Hi, this is Al. I would think that veterans would fall under either employee or applicant and would follow the same type of guidelines. I don't think veterans is considered a protected class that we would need to address separately in the policy, but that's totally up to you. That's just my opinion.
Well, since we're talking about protected classes, because there are rules about protections for veterans, so.
There are separate statutory rules for veterans, which probably is a reason it hasn't been in the policy before.
But there are separate statutes on every single one of these people in line, aren't there?
Well, typically they're, for the employment at least, it's Title VII, or for the students, it's Title IX, and they merge many of these together.
So English by limited, English proficient district community members. I have some questions about that. What does that actually, I saw the definition, so I know what that means. I just want to understand the ramification of it. Does that mean that we have to provide textbooks multilingual? Does that mean we have to provide, I know we do a fine job in our ESOL department. We already do some of that, but I'm just curious, is this going to create an additional burden on our ESOL department? Is this going to require additional regulations? Is this going to require additional expense on the district? How would this manifest itself over and above what we're currently doing for our ESOL students?
Yeah, so this language actually was pulled from your old policy. It's actually, I think, right out of the what had been in the prior policy, if I'm not mistaken.
The separate discrimination policy 2.81.
Okay, well, I still have the question.
2.81. But I think, to answer your question, look, I think the primary purpose of including that here, I mean, obviously a lot of what we were focusing on was the issue of harassment on a protected class. We were concerned about, in addition to, for example, harassment on the basis of ethnic or national origin, religion, race, color. Limited English proficiency would be another basis that there could be some students that could be subjected to ridicule or harassment based on their accent or something along those lines. So that was kind of the primary reason for including that language in there. Now, your question, I think, is really more on the discrimination side. Does that expand perhaps the rights of someone of limited English proficiency to, demand certain things from the school district that you hadn't previously been required to provide, like a textbook in, let's say Spanish or something. And I don't believe, we don't believe that would be the case. I mean, I think obviously, if
if there's a good reason for making distinctions with certain things, like if you, for example, in employment applications, if someone's applying to be a teacher in the school district, it would seem to me that being able to, master the communication skills with the English language is going to be a requirement of that job, and it's an appropriate requirement that's rationally connected to fulfilling those job requirements, and therefore you couldn't be accused of discriminating against someone in the job application because you didn't hire someone because they didn't speak English well or something. But if it was a job that did not require language skills for any particular reason, then there would be no reason to discriminate against someone just because they're not entirely proficient with the English language.
But you're saying this is currently in our 2.7 policy?
It's currently in, I believe, 2.81, was it, Kendra?
Yeah, it's a seemingly short policy on it lists your discrimination protected classes.
Well, my next question is, well, do you expect this to require us to have additional personnel? Is it going? It seems like that to me. I just want to make sure I understand. Will this require us to hire additional people in order to meet these new procedures?
I mean, I don't believe so. I mean, I guess the question is, what are you doing now currently to address any needs of, say, students who are limited English proficient? We weren't anticipating necessarily that this policy is going to expand what you're currently doing on that, but I will say we didn't focus particularly on that aspect of it.
May I ask Mr. Hereda the same question?
Well, I think, Mark, you're answering, yes. I think, Mark, you're answering that based on the English language learners. I think overall what Eric is asking is the policy as a whole, which in my opinion would require